On a crisp autumn morning in Atlanta, the stately marble steps of the Jefferson County Courthouse gleamed under the early sun. Inside the hallowed halls, Judge Denise Carter, a composed and dignified African-American woman, sat in her judicial seat. Known for her quiet resolve and firm sense of justice, Judge Carter had dedicated her life to upholding the law. The atmosphere was usually calm and methodical, as legal proceedings had a rhythm of their own. Yet this particular morning, an unexpected event shattered that routine. As court was about to commence, a murmur ran through the gallery. Two uniformed officers, their eyes clouded by prejudice and a misguided sense of superiority, abruptly entered the courtroom. They were known in hushed circles for their biased attitudes, though few had witnessed their contempt firsthand. The officers had come with an air of unearned authority and, in a moment of shocking impulsivity, one of them stepped forward and delivered a swift, hard slap across Judge Carter's face. The sound of the slap echoed off the walls of the courtroom. Gasps and shocked whispers filled the room as stunned onlookers struggled to comprehend what had just occurred. The officers, unaware of the true identity of the person before them, had targeted the judge simply because of assumptions born from deep-seated prejudice. Their actions, unthinking and cruel, marked the beginning of an event that would soon unravel layers of injustice long hidden beneath the surface of the legal system. Judge Carter, momentarily taken aback by the physical assault, quickly regained her composure. Despite the shock, there was a glint of steely resolve in her eyes. She was no stranger to adversity. In fact, her career had been punctuated by moments when she had to stand up against discrimination and systemic bias. Yet, this was different, a public affront in her own courtroom, delivered by those sworn to protect the law. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as the gravity of the situation set in. Outside the imposing walls of the courthouse, the city of Atlanta carried on with its daily routine, blissfully unaware that a spark had just been ignited. Inside, however, every heartbeat echoed the intensity of that single, fateful moment. The incident not only disrespected the dignity of a revered public servant but also served as a stark reminder of the persistent inequities simmering beneath society's surface. In that charged moment, as Judge Carter stared directly into the eyes of those who had erred so gravely, a silent vow took shape within her. It was a vow to seek justice, to expose the rot festering within the corridors of power, and to ensure that the truth could no longer be concealed by the force of a badge or the weight of prejudice. The courtroom, once a sanctuary of impartial justice, had just become the opening chapter in a story of redemption and accountability. Judge Denise Carter's reputation in Atlanta was built over decades of unwavering service and a steadfast commitment to fairness. Born and raised in the heart of the city, she witnessed firsthand the challenges and disparities that marked the lives of many in her community. Even as a young woman, Denise was driven by a burning desire to make a difference, a desire that would ultimately lead her to the bench. After earning her law degree, she faced numerous obstacles: subtle discrimination, unwarranted microaggressions, and institutional biases that seemed woven into the fabric of the legal system. Yet, with every hurdle, she emerged more determined. In the courtroom and beyond, Denise became known for her calm authority and meticulous attention to detail. Her decisions, rendered with both compassion and firmness, earned her respect from colleagues and fear from those who sought to bend the law for their own gain. On that fateful morning, as the shock of the earlier assault still rippled through the courthouse corridors, whispers of Denise's storied past began to circulate among those present. Her rise to becoming Atlanta's first African-American female judge was not only a triumph over adversity, it was a beacon of hope for countless citizens who longed for change. Denise's journey had been punctuated by moments of quiet defiance and bold stands for what was right. Each ruling, each case, further cemented her legacy as a tireless advocate for justice. In private moments away from the public eye, Judge Carter often recalled the countless times she had been underestimated simply because of the color of her skin. Yet she also remembered the encouraging words of mentors and the gratitude of ordinary citizens whose lives had been touched by her decisions. Those memories, both painful and uplifting, fueled her commitment to ensure that no injustice, no matter how deeply entrenched, could continue unchecked. As she sat in her chambers after the incident, Denise meticulously reviewed case files and legal precedents. She knew that the assault was not merely an isolated act of physical aggression but a symptom of a larger, more insidious problem within the system. That morning had become a turning point, a call to action. It was a stark reminder that the struggle for equality and fairness was far from over. Determined to turn this moment of disgrace into one of transformative change, Judge Carter resolved to use her position to expose and dismantle the deep-seated corruption that had long festered behind closed doors. Her personal history of overcoming prejudice and discrimination gave her a unique perspective on the injustices embedded in the system. And as the day unfolded, she began to draft a plan, one that would not only hold accountable those who had wronged her but also shine a light on the broader network of institutional bias affecting the lives of so many. With a quiet resolve and the strength born of years of struggle, Judge Denise Carter prepared to face the challenges ahead. The incident had set in motion events that would redefine justice in Atlanta, and she was ready to lead that change, one determined step at a time. Later that same morning, as the courthouse began to buzz with anxious energy, Sergeant Robert Hayes made his presence known in a way that would further unsettle the already charged atmosphere. A seasoned officer with decades of service, Hayes was known for his imposing stature and the authority that his uniform commanded. Yet on this day, his behavior deviated sharply from the expected decorum of law enforcement. Sergeant Hayes entered the courtroom with a brisk stride and a steely gaze. To many, his reputation had been that of a dedicated public servant. However, those familiar with the undercurrents of prejudice whispered that his commitment to the law was marred by a bias that ran deep. As he crossed paths with Judge Carter, his eyes narrowed, not with recognition of her esteemed position, but with a condescending dismissal that spoke volumes about his internal prejudices. In that moment, the air seemed to thicken with tension. Judge Carter, still recovering from the earlier assault, immediately sensed that something was awry. There was an unmistakable undercurrent in Hayes' demeanor, a subtle yet dangerous mix of entitlement and disrespect. The sergeant's tone as he addressed her was curt and laden with an unspoken challenge. His words, delivered with a dismissive snap, suggested that he considered himself above her authority. For Judge Carter, this was not the first time that her identity had been undermined by those who believed that their power could eclipse her competence. In her years on the bench, she had encountered many who sought to diminish her contributions and question her decisions. Yet, every encounter had only served to fortify her resolve. Standing before Sergeant Hayes, she maintained a calm exterior even as a storm of indignation brewed beneath her composed surface. The brief exchange, though laced with the simmering heat of unacknowledged bias, unfolded with an eerie quietness. The courtroom spectators exchanged uneasy glances, their collective breath held in anticipation of what might come next. For a few long moments, time itself appeared to slow as the silent power dynamics between the judge and the officer became palpable to everyone present. Sergeant Hayes, accustomed to a certain level of deference, seemed taken aback by the unyielding determination in Judge Carter's eyes. His previously self-assured stride faltered just slightly, as if he recognized, at least for a moment, that the rules of engagement in this courtroom were not the same as on the street. The confrontation was subtle but potent, a microcosm of the broader struggles between institutional authority and the unyielding quest for true justice. Judge Carter's inner thoughts churned as she assessed the situation. She knew that Hayes's disrespect was not a mere lapse in professionalism, it was part of a much larger pattern of systemic bias that had long plagued the corridors of power. And as the murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, she silently vowed that this day would mark the beginning of a thorough reckoning, a pursuit of accountability that would extend far beyond the confines of that single encounter. In the tense moments following Sergeant Hayes's dismissive remark, the courtroom atmosphere shifted dramatically. The quiet murmur of legal proceedings was replaced by an electric tension. Judge Denise Carter, her composure now the fulcrum of a rapidly escalating situation, rose from her seat. Every eye in the room fixed on her as she prepared to address the blatant disrespect that had just been exhibited. Sergeant Hayes, Judge Carter's voice rang out clear and authoritative, "I demand an explanation for your conduct." Her words, firm and measured, cut through the silence like a clarion call for accountability. The courtroom, which had been rife with anxious whispers, fell into a deep, expectant quiet. Sergeant Hayes's face flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment. For years, he had operated under the assumption that his position and badge granted him untouchable authority. However, in the face of Judge Carter's unyielding gaze, that sense of invincibility began to crumble. "Your Honor," he stammered, attempting to reclaim control of the situation, "I was merely," but his protest was abruptly halted by the stern, unwavering look in Carter's eyes. For Judge Carter, this confrontation was not only about the personal affront she had endured but also a stand against the long history of abuse by those in positions of power. "There is no excuse for your behavior," she stated firmly, her voice resonating throughout the chamber. "Your actions have no place in this courtroom or anywhere else under the law." With each word, she reasserted her authority in a manner that was both dignified and uncompromising. The reaction among the spectators was immediate. Legal aides, attorneys, and even members of the public could sense that they were witnessing a pivotal moment, a moment where an established order was being challenged by the very person who embodied justice. Some exchanged glances of admiration, while others appeared apprehensive, aware that the ripple effects of this confrontation could alter the fabric of law enforcement practices. As the minutes ticked by, the confrontation deepened. Judge Carter calmly detailed the principles that had guided her career, emphasizing fairness, accountability, and the unassailable right of every individual to be treated with dignity. "Today," she continued, "we are not only addressing a personal violation, but we are also confronting a system that too often shields those who abuse their power." Her words reverberated across the room, stirring a mix of defiance and reflection among those present. Sergeant Hayes, caught between his ingrained beliefs and the stark reality of the judge's determination, began to falter. His earlier bravado gave way to a stuttering defense. I only meant," he tried once more, but his voice wavered. Judge Carter interjected with a measured tone that brooked no further argument. "Your badge may have given you authority in the past, but it does not grant you immunity from accountability," she declared, her tone firm yet devoid of personal animosity. It was a statement that resonated far beyond the confines of that singular exchange. The tension in the room was palpable as every detail of the confrontation was etched into the minds of those witnessing it. Reporters, already present for routine proceedings, scribbled notes furiously. The incident, which might have otherwise been dismissed as a momentary lapse in decorum, was rapidly evolving into a defining moment in the struggle for justice in Atlanta. In the ensuing minutes, the air grew thick with anticipation. Judge Carter's measured persistence and unwavering resolve had set a tone that none in the courtroom would soon forget. Even as Sergeant Hayes attempted to salvage what remained of his authority with stuttering justifications, the damage was done. The courtroom had become a stage for an urgent declaration, that no individual, regardless of rank or position, was above the law. As the confrontation drew to a close, the judge returned to her seat with a sense of quiet dignity. Yet her mind was already racing ahead. She knew that this was merely the beginning, a spark that would ignite a far-reaching investigation into abuses of power and entrenched corruption within the system. That single moment, charged with emotion and defiance, had set in motion a series of events that would soon force the hidden injustices of Atlanta's legal establishment into the harsh light of public scrutiny. In the charged silence that followed the confrontation, Judge Denise Carter sat back behind her bench, her expression resolute as she contemplated the next steps. The courtroom, still buzzing with the energy of the recent showdown, now bore witness to a moment that would redefine the relationship between law enforcement and the judiciary. With calm determination, Judge Carter issued a stark warning that reverberated throughout the chamber. "Sergeant Hayes," she began, her voice steady and authoritative, "know this, I will file formal complaints for your misconduct. Your badge no longer shields you from the consequences of your actions." Each word was deliberate, a measured response that carried the weight of her years of experience and the unyielding pursuit of justice. The pronouncement was met with a mix of shock and murmured agreement among the observers in the room. It was a moment when the traditional hierarchies were challenged, and the message was unequivocal: no one was above accountability. In the days that followed, the echo of Judge Carter's warning resonated far beyond the courthouse walls. News of the confrontation spread quickly throughout Atlanta. Local media outlets, always on the lookout for stories of systemic reform, reported on the unprecedented event with fervor. Within hours, the incident had become the focal point of discussions about police accountability and the need for sweeping changes in how law enforcement was held to the same standards as every other citizen. Judge Carter, aware of the far-reaching implications of her declaration, began the arduous process of documenting every detail of the incident. In her meticulously kept files, she recorded the sequence of events, the specific actions taken by Sergeant Hayes, and the responses from the courtroom. Her record was thorough, each note a testament to her commitment to ensuring that every injustice, no matter how small it might seem, was brought into the light. At the same time, she convened a meeting with trusted colleagues and legal advisors. In a private session held in the quiet backroom of the courthouse, Judge Carter outlined her strategy for filing formal complaints. She discussed the legal precedents that supported her actions, the documentation needed to substantiate her claims, and the steps required to initiate a broader investigation into systemic misconduct within the force. Her colleagues listened intently, aware that they were on the cusp of challenging a long-entrenched system of unchecked authority. The public response was swift and polarized. Community activists hailed Judge Carter's actions as a long-overdue stand against institutional racism and corruption. Vigils were organized outside the courthouse, and local leaders praised her unwavering commitment to justice. In contrast, some within the police department and their supporters decried her actions, arguing that she had overstepped her bounds. Yet despite the conflicting opinions, one thing was clear: the message was resounding and unmistakable. Corruption and abuse of power would no longer be tolerated. As the formal complaints were being drafted and submitted, Judge Carter continued her own quiet investigation. The incident had not been an isolated act of misconduct, it was a symptom of a much deeper malaise within the system. With each passing day, she grew increasingly determined to uncover the broader network of accountability failures that had allowed such behavior to fester unchecked. Every piece of evidence she gathered was a step toward dismantling the protective barriers that had long shielded those in power from scrutiny. Late into the nights, while the city of Atlanta slept, Judge Carter pored over case files and internal reports, her eyes scanning for any sign of the corruption that had become all too familiar. The weight of her responsibilities was immense, yet she pressed on with unwavering resolve. She knew that her actions in that courtroom were not just about one man's misconduct. They were about restoring faith in a system that had lost its way. In the end, the warning she had issued was more than a threat, it was a clarion call for justice. Judge Carter's steadfast refusal to tolerate abuse of power marked the beginning of a journey that would not only hold Sergeant Hayes accountable but also pave the way for a systemic transformation in Atlanta's legal institutions. It was a promise that those who thought themselves above the law would soon find themselves facing the full force of a determined, principled system of justice. In the wake of the explosive confrontation and the public outcry that followed, Judge Denise Carter embarked on an investigation that promised to peel back layers of long-hidden misconduct. With the formal complaints against Sergeant Hayes now in motion, she dedicated herself to uncovering every detail of his past behavior. A mission fueled by the conviction that no one in a position of authority should be allowed to operate without oversight. In the quiet solitude of her private chambers, Judge Carter began sifting through a multitude of records. Old case files, internal memos, and anonymous tips were laid out before her like pieces of a complex puzzle. Every document, every note, was a potential clue in a trail that stretched back years. She recalled earlier instances when subtle reports of misconduct had surfaced, reports that had been dismissed or swept under the rug by a system too afraid of confronting its own flaws. The investigation quickly took on a life of its own. Judge Carter worked tirelessly, often well into the early hours of the morning, driven by a sense of duty and the memory of that fateful day when prejudice had struck her in the courtroom. She reached out to former colleagues, attorneys who had long questioned the integrity of the police department, and even community activists who had observed the quiet injustices that occurred daily in Atlanta. Their testimonies, each tinged with both sorrow and determination, confirmed that the assault by Sergeant Hayes was only the most visible manifestation of a far more insidious problem. As she delved deeper, the breadth of the investigation became evident. It was no longer just about one officer's moment of misconduct, it was about the entire framework that allowed such behavior to persist. Judge Carter uncovered a pattern, a series of overlooked complaints, internal reviews that had been conveniently classified as low priority, and a network of unwritten rules that protected officers from facing the consequences of their actions. The deeper she looked, the more she realized that the system itself was complicit in the cover-ups that had shielded misconduct for far too long. In a series of confidential meetings with legal experts and reform advocates, Judge Carter pieced together a narrative that painted a grim picture of institutional failure. The evidence pointed to a culture of silence and complicity, where even the most damning reports were brushed aside in favor of maintaining the status quo. It was a revelation that both angered and galvanized her. Determined not to let these injustices continue, she began to outline a plan for a comprehensive review of the department's internal practices. Over several weeks, Judge Carter methodically compiled her findings. Every email, every dated report was meticulously catalogued. She reached out to a few whistleblowers who had remained in the shadows for years, assuring them that their courage in coming forward would not be in vain. Each conversation added another layer to the emerging picture of systemic corruption, one that was deeply entrenched and alarmingly widespread. Yet amid the painstaking work, Judge Carter maintained her calm. Her approach was both scholarly and resolute, as she balanced the demands of her current judicial responsibilities with the immense pressure of the investigation. The courthouse, once a quiet arena for the administration of justice, had transformed into the nerve center of a burgeoning crusade against abuse of power. Every day, she inched closer to uncovering the full extent of the misconduct that had plagued the department. As the investigation gathered momentum, Judge Carter's determination never wavered. She knew that the evidence she was collecting would not only bring Sergeant Hayes to justice but would also serve as the catalyst for a larger reform of the system. The once hidden patterns of neglect, bias, and corruption were beginning to reveal themselves in stark detail, and with each discovery, her resolve to root out injustice grew stronger. The work was grueling, and the stakes were incredibly high. But for Judge Denise Carter, the pursuit of truth was paramount. The investigation was no longer just about retribution for a personal slight, it was about safeguarding the integrity of Atlanta's judicial system for future generations. In her tireless quest for accountability, she prepared to challenge every preconceived notion, confident that the truth would ultimately prevail. As Judge Denise Carter's investigation deepened, the trail of evidence began to unravel a sprawling network of corruption that reached far beyond the confines of a single incident. What had initially appeared as isolated lapses in judgment soon revealed themselves as integral threads in a much larger tapestry of misconduct within Atlanta's law enforcement and judicial systems. Judge Carter's methodical approach led her to scrutinize the intricate relationships between Sergeant Robert Hayes and various other figures in the system. Through countless hours of poring over case files, financial records, and internal communications, she unearthed disturbing patterns of unethical behavior. It became evident that Hayes was not acting alone, he was a crucial node in a network that included certain district attorneys and police officials who had long operated under a veil of impunity. In late-night sessions filled with the soft hum of overhead lights and the rustling of paper, Judge Carter painstakingly traced the financial trails. Irregularities emerged in the form of questionable financial contributions, transactions that, on the surface, appeared innocuous but, upon closer examination, revealed connections to illicit deals and preferential treatment. The documents pointed to a system where mismanaged legal cases were not only commonplace but were used as a currency to reward loyalty and silence dissent. Every new piece of evidence added weight to her suspicions. Whistleblowers, emboldened by Judge Carter's reputation for fairness and perseverance, began to come forward with first-hand accounts of corrupt practices. In confidential interviews held in discreet locations, former law enforcement officers and administrative staff described how complaints against certain officers were routinely dismissed, and how powerful individuals within the system colluded to cover up transgressions. Their stories, though delivered in hushed tones, painted a damning picture of a network designed to protect its own interests at any cost. The investigation soon revealed that the protective shield around Sergeant Hayes was part of a broader effort to insulate corrupt practices from public scrutiny. The involvement of district attorneys and other influential figures suggested that the corruption was systemic, one that had been allowed to fester for years by those who were entrusted with upholding the law. As Judge Carter connected the dots, the scale of the network became undeniable. It was a web of alliances and covert agreements that had enabled unethical financial contributions to flow freely, thereby ensuring that misconduct went unpunished. Judge Carter, ever mindful of the responsibility she bore as a guardian of justice, recognized that dismantling this network would require more than just exposing a few isolated incidents. It would demand a comprehensive overhaul of the systems and safeguards that allowed such corruption to thrive. In meetings with legal experts and reform advocates, she outlined her findings and proposed a series of reforms aimed at increasing transparency and accountability within the judicial and law enforcement institutions. With every new discovery, the stakes grew higher. The evidence suggested that the corruption not only undermined public trust but also compromised the integrity of the legal process itself. Judge Carter's resolve hardened as she realized that her fight was not solely for personal vindication but for the future of justice in Atlanta. Judge Denise Carter's unyielding quest to expose the intertwined relationships and financial improprieties not only threatened to upend a corrupt system but also promised to restore the faith of a community that had long suffered under its weight. Her findings were set to be a turning point, one that would compel Atlanta to confront its darkest secrets and forge a path toward true accountability and reform. Armed with a meticulously compiled dossier of evidence, Judge Denise Carter stepped forward to confront the institution that had long shielded misconduct within its ranks. At 33:19, with the eyes of the public and the ethics board fixed firmly upon her, she addressed both the officials and the gathered media in a press conference that would soon make headlines across Atlanta. In a stately room set aside for such deliberations, Judge Carter stood at a podium, her voice steady and resolute as she laid out the intricate web of corruption she had uncovered. The connections between Sergeant Hayes and certain members of our law enforcement and prosecutorial bodies are not merely coincidental, she declared. Her words were clear and direct, leaving little room for misinterpretation. With precision, she detailed how unethical financial transactions and mismanaged legal cases had become a systematic tool to protect those in power. Her presentation was a masterful blend of legal acumen and personal testimony. Judge Carter methodically reviewed the evidence, a series of documents, internal memos, and testimonies, that together painted a damning picture of collusion and cover-ups. Every fact was laid bare, ensuring that the ethics board could no longer ignore the severity of the situation. Journalists recorded every word, aware that the revelations would spark a broader conversation about accountability in the justice system. As she spoke, the room grew silent, each listener absorbing the weight of her revelations. For many, her courageous stand was a turning point. The transparency with which she approached the issue inspired both hope and determination among reform advocates who had long demanded change. In that moment, Judge Carter wasn't merely addressing a board or answering reporters' questions, she was heralding a new era of accountability and integrity. Her closing remarks were both a call to action and a promise of continued vigilance. We cannot allow the sanctity of our justice system to be undermined by those who abuse their power, she affirmed, her tone imbued with both urgency and resolve. With those final words, she stepped away from the podium, leaving in her wake a silence that spoke volumes about the impact of her message. At 45:37, as Judge Denise Carter continued to peel back the layers of corruption, a startling connection emerged, one that linked Sergeant Robert Hayes to a high-profile homicide case involving a respected journalist. This revelation sent shockwaves through both the legal community and the broader public. In an unexpected twist, the investigation took on a dimension that hinted at a conspiracy far more complex and deeply rooted than anyone had previously imagined. Judge Carter learned that the journalist in question had been relentlessly pursuing a story on corruption within the police department before tragically losing their life. As she examined the case files, inconsistencies began to surface, irregularities in evidence, unexplained delays in the investigation, and a pattern of suppressed testimonies. Each new detail suggested that Hayes's network of influence might have extended even into the realm of silencing those who dared to expose the truth. Determined to understand the full scope of the cover-up, Judge Carter revisited the journalist's last days. In a series of confidential interviews with colleagues and friends of the late reporter, she gathered accounts of intimidation and subtle threats that had plagued the pursuit of their groundbreaking work. These accounts, chilling in their implications, underscored the dangerous lengths to which those in power would go to protect their secrets. The connection between Hayes and the journalist's case added a layer of urgency to the investigation. It was no longer just about addressing isolated acts of misconduct. It was about confronting a systemic effort to quash dissent and maintain an unyielding grip on power. Judge Carter's resolve hardened as she realized that exposing this connection could be the key to unraveling the entire network of corruption. In a series of detailed hearings and private meetings, she presented the evidence to trusted legal advisors and members of the investigative team. Every detail, from internal memos to forensic records, was scrutinized and corroborated. The narrative that emerged was disturbing, a portrait of a system willing to compromise justice in order to silence critical voices and protect its own. The implications were profound, and the public response, once the story broke, was one of both outrage and a clamor for reform. For Judge Carter, this discovery was both a vindication of her efforts and a stark reminder of the challenges that lay ahead. The journalist's untimely death was not a tragic accident but a calculated act designed to send a chilling message to all who would dare to expose corruption. With this knowledge, she redoubled her efforts, determined to ensure that the sacrifices made in the pursuit of truth would not be in vain. After months of relentless investigation, public pressure, and numerous legal battles, the courtroom became the stage for the final act of a drama that had gripped the city of Atlanta. At 53:05, Judge Denise Carter, with unwavering determination, presented the undeniable truth in a landmark trial that would forever change the face of justice in the region. In a packed courtroom filled with reporters, community leaders, and citizens eager for accountability, the evidence that Judge Carter had painstakingly gathered was laid out for all to see. The meticulously compiled dossier detailed Sergeant Robert Hayes's history of misconduct, the extensive network of corruption involving influential district attorneys and police officials, and the shocking link to the journalist's unsolved homicide. Every piece of evidence was presented with clarity and precision, leaving no doubt that the time for secrecy had ended. As the proceedings unfolded, emotions ran high. Testimonies from whistleblowers, experts, and even former colleagues of Hayes painted a damning picture of a system that had long protected its own at the expense of justice. Judge Carter's courtroom became not only a venue for legal proceedings but also a forum for public reckoning, a moment when the collective voice of a community demanding change was finally heard. The trial was a turning point. When the verdict was read, Sergeant Hayes was convicted on multiple counts of misconduct and complicity. The conviction was more than just a personal vindication for Judge Carter, it was a resounding statement that no badge or authority was above the law. In the aftermath, a comprehensive statewide investigation was launched, setting in motion reforms aimed at dismantling the corrupt network that had allowed such abuses to flourish for so long. For Judge Carter, the victory was bittersweet. The monumental effort to bring justice to light had exacted a personal toll, and she recognized that the system she had fought so hard to reform was in desperate need of healing. In an act that underscored her commitment to the principles of fairness and accountability, she made the difficult decision to resign from her position on the bench. Her resignation was not an admission of defeat, but rather a final act of service, a sacrifice made in the name of justice and in the hope of inspiring lasting change. Her departure from the courtroom marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, a future where the lessons learned from this struggle would guide the transformation of Atlanta's legal system. The community, emboldened by her courage and determination, vowed to continue the fight for transparency and integrity, ensuring that the legacy of Judge Denise Carter would serve as a beacon for generations to come.